Why hasn't Ten Hag given sufficient minutes in the second half of this season to Amad Diallo, and why exactly is he so insistent on giving those minutes to Antony? And it's not just Amad Diallo, it's also players like Alvaro Fernandez, Dan Gore, James Garner, and I will be analysing both Ten Hag and United's role in allowing a substantial amount of youth prospects to leave. But let's first come on to the big question: why is Ten Hag so insistent on giving Antony minutes over Amad Diallo? Well, the answer is pretty obvious, but once you actually break it down, you can start to see it from Ten Hag's perspective a lot more. And the answer is that Ten Hag knows come the end of the season, when Ineos are making a decision as to whether to keep him as manager, or even if he does depart United and is looking for another job next season, he's going to be judged not just on his tactical setup, his results, but also his ability to identify players from a recruitment perspective, but also his ability to develop players once they're brought in. And so when coming into the start of 2024, Ten Hag probably realised he's got 3 to 4, maybe even 5 months to fully prove himself. And one factor that a lot of people are going to judge him on is the progression of Antony, because let's be real, Antony's signing really has hurt Ten Hag's reputation. Because it's not just that he isn't an £85 million player, it's that he's probably not even a Manchester United player full stop. And so my theory is that Ten Hag knows that Amad and Antony both aren't going to be key players in the back end of this season. That's going to be Garnacho, Rashford and Højlund. And so neither are going to be starters, but also both need to be played into form. And this means that both players need about 10 to 15 games to fully get into form, to really get into the flow of things and show what they can actually do. But I think this is where there's a big conflict of interest as to what is best for Ten Hag and what's best for United in the mid to long term. But before I get into that, if you're a fan of football nostalgia and you want to reminisce about the days when United legitimately probably had the best academy setup in world football, then go over to Jersey FIFA. They've got all the Manchester United retro jerseys through the 90s and 2000s. If you use code Atlantis at checkout, you'll get a discount. A link will be in my Instagram bio, which will be linked in the description. But in regards to the conflict of interest, from Ten Hag's perspective, he doesn't have any guarantees that he's going to be at United long term. Even if he stays for next season, he's only got 1 year left on his contract come the summer. And so rightfully so, for the second half of the season, he's obviously focused on the results on the pitch. But when it comes to player development out of Antony or Amad, Ten Hag is always going to side with Antony, because he knows that even if he departs in the summer, a lot of his reputation is going to hang on how Antony does at United. If Antony absolutely bombs out at United and gets sold in the summer, when Ten Hag goes for another job, that is going to linger with him, giving him less leverage when he's trying to negotiate how much control he has of a club's recruitment. And even if he does stay at United for next season, with the likes of Dan Ashworth, Omar Barada and maybe even someone like Paul Mitchell coming in as well, Ten Hag is probably going to have to recede some of the control he has over recruitment, just because Ineos are going to hand a lot of control over to Barada, Ashworth and maybe Paul Mitchell as well. And that could involve getting rid of Ten Hag's transfer veto, which he has had for the last 2 summers, and apparently is adamant about keeping. But when looking at Ineos and United's interest as a whole, you'd have to say giving Amad Diallo more playing time throughout the second half of the season is definitely something they would have been hoping for, because as I've said before, the last thing we want is coming into the summer transfer window and not really knowing how good Amad actually is. Is he capable of bringing strong enough competition to whichever right winger replaces Antony at the club, or does he need a loan maybe to a Premier League side? We just don't know unless he gets game time. But my concern around Ten Hag's ability to judge and then develop United's youth players doesn't just stop with Amad Diallo. And I actually made this segment of the video towards the back end of the January transfer window, but I think a lot of the points that I make are still extremely relevant. But just quickly, I was planning to release an analysis video on Mathys Tel after he was linked with Manchester United the other week, but it has now come out that Bayern do intend to keep him for next season. So as I've done with some of my other unreleased videos as well, I've put that onto my Patreon. You can get a 7-day free trial, I'll leave it linked in the description. And I've also got a podcast episode just come out on where I think Xabi Alonso should go next. It's the summer of 2022. Manchester United have just won the FA Youth Cup. Future stars Alejandro Garnacho and Kobbie Mainoo are the 2 who will make the leap into being key players in the United first team. Fantastic. And you'd think that we should surely also have at least 2 or 3 others, at the very least being squad players by the summer of 2024. Alvaro Fernandez, Marc Jurado, Mateo Kovar, Tendon Mengi, Dan Gore, Zidane Iqbal, and slightly older players like Anthony Elanga and James Garner. That is a great crop of young players. However, apart from Dan Gore, none of the others are even at the club. Garner, Elanga, Iqbal, Mengi and Jurado were all sold for literally only about 30 million collectively. For some reason, Alvaro Fernandez was sent on loan in the summer when Malacia and Shaw were injured, and even after Reguilón was sent back to Tottenham this month, Fernandes still didn't get an opportunity even after returning from his half-season loan at Granada. He's been loaned out to Benfica, who do have an option to buy for about £6 million, or an obligation to buy for around £9 million if he plays 50% of their games. Now United do have a buyback clause, which is why the fee is so low, but even still, why would you sell Fernandes for pretty much 1/5 of what any decent left back that Manchester United could sign as a replacement would cost? Especially when I, like many others, think that he'd be the perfect alternative to both Malacia and Shaw. Whilst Luke Shaw is still the starter and Malacia obviously the backup, even if Fernandes was retained, the Spaniard would still be a valuable asset for Ten Hag in the second half of this season. First of all, Luke Shaw is going to be needed as a left-sided centre-back when Lisandro Martinez isn't playing, and even still, neither Malacia or Shaw offer the sort of dynamism and powerful ball-carrying ability going forward that Fernandes would bring down that left side, something I think United have been crying out for, with Rashford and Garnacho desperately needing an overlapping left-back behind them to suit their game. United also don't really have a player capable of playing as a left wing-back, with both Malacia and Shaw not really having the type of output in the final third that you'd probably want from a wing-back, being much more suited to playing as left-sided centre-backs than playing in that wing-back role. All in all, unless the buyback clause is less than something like £20 million, I honestly can't see why United would loan him out with an option to buy or even an obligation to buy. I think that Álvaro Fernandes is perfect to come into the United squad next season, loan him out for the second half of this season, and then when he comes back as a 21-year-old with a year's experience in the Championship, 6 months in La Liga and 6 months in Liga NOS now with Benfica, surely he's ready for at the very least a squad player role next season. And for me, Ten Hag has to take at least some of the blame. I mean, he's allowed both Garner and Elanga to go for between 25 to £30 million collectively, both players who I think would have been massive assets to United this season. Anthony Elanga at Forest this season looks like the type of player that United need on the right, far better than Anthony, but who isn't at this point, but also Pellistri as well. It's been obvious for about 18 to 24 months that Pellistri isn't anywhere near good enough. Even in his teenage years I was sceptical. But why on earth would we allow Elanga to leave, who even at Manchester United showed a lot more than Pellistri, but also is a homegrown player? Facundo Pellistri is not even Premier League level, and frankly, I just don't see the potential at all. Is he really any better than Dan James? Not in my opinion. Yet at the age of 22, he's still at United, not even featuring in the first team. £15 million for Elanga, that fee should be at least £25 million to as much as £30 million. James Garner was sold for £9 million, with the fee potentially rising to 15. What is the point in that? He was probably worth about £20 million at the time he was sold, but is it even worth us selling our homegrown players, who are more than good enough to command a place in this squad, if we aren't getting big enough fees to then reinvest in upgrades? Ten Hag isn't negotiating the fees for these players, I'll accept that, but his terrible talent IQ doesn't just stop when it comes to new signings, but also the existing squad and youth players as well. Elanga, Garner and Fernandes should still be in that squad, I won't hear otherwise, particularly when you've brought in Reguilón for half a season. Anthony and Pellistri have been your two main right wing options, and United desperately lack a versatile central midfielder who can not only fulfil roles in the midfield, but also be used as a player to interchange into fullback-like positions during certain phases of play, which Garner showcased that he can do with the England youth teams and Everton as well. Scott McTominay is far too limited positionally for the style and the system that Ten Hag is trying to play. I'd take Garner over him any day. Even Christian Eriksen, despite still being a great deeper line playmaker in possession, just doesn't have the sort of athleticism or defensive capabilities that Ten Hag needs in the midfield, and Garner would definitely bring. So whilst Ten Hag doesn't take the blame for the ridiculously low transfer fees, these players are only being sold because Ten Hag somehow looks at the current United squad and can't find a place for them, despite needing a left back, a central midfielder and a right winger as well. There's also been rumours in this January transfer window that Dangor could go out on loan to a League One side, and all I can say is why. He's barely been given a chance and is now 19, 20 in September. You could maybe argue that Iqbal, Menji and Gerardo weren't good enough to warrant minutes in the first team, but Gore alongside Fernandes definitely is. I mean, we aren't Manchester City, we are still starting one of Eriksen and McTominay in most games, we are out of everything but the FA Cup, and probably aren't getting top 4, so surely this is the perfect time to throw Dangor in instead of Eriksen, because honestly what is the point in continuing to play Eriksen when he's not good enough anymore to warrant a significant role in the squad, and defensively is a complete liability because of his lack of legs. McTominay came on for Eriksen against Tottenham, surely that could have been Dangor. I said before that the Solskjaer era did a lot of long-term damage to Manchester United because of the wasted potential of that squad, and the no strategy signings that were made. But now, compared to what's going on, Solskjaer's era looks like an improvement. Ten Hag is definitely to blame for failing to introduce these players into the first team, but whoever's overseeing football operations at United over the past year or so is so bad at their job. I honestly think you could just throw any competent fan in there and they'd make better decisions. And at least then we'd still have maybe 2 or 3 players in the squad alongside Mainu and Garnacho who have come through the youth academy and can develop into solid squad players or even starting players over the next few seasons.